Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Dino. It's a beautiful Saturday morning here in Niagara Falls, and I thought, what better day than to get up bright and early, go for a ride, and try out this new Garmin 610 Montana GPS that I installed in the last episode. However, when I got out not too far from the driveway, well, I realized I'm having the same issue with this Garmin 610 as I did with my Garmin Nuvi. And what that issue is I keep losing charging conductivity. So as you're riding along, all of a sudden a warning will come up saying external power lost. Do you want me to shut off or do you want me to stay running? This is the same issue I was having with my Nuvi on my last long trip last fall, and I really thought that it was just an issue of the Garmin had gotten wet and it was starting to malfunction. So I didn't really dig any deeper because I knew I had this Garmin 610 that I could just put on and plug in and away I go. Unfortunately, not digging any deeper isn't paying off for me, and I should have tested my electrical conductivity and that on the bike before I even went any further. I seem to be having this issue that when I ride, just sort of off idle and normal cruising speeds, I'm getting about 12.5 to 13.5 volts of charging power coming through my cigarette lighter adapter. But as I increase the throttle and RPM rises, I lose that charging function and voltage drops. Sometimes I think I've seen it as low as 10 volts. When I let off, the voltage comes back up and it starts to charge again. And what's really weird is it only happens when I'm riding. If I try to simulate it just sitting here in the shed by revving the engine, it doesn't seem to do it, at least not as pronounced as when the engine's under some load, I suppose. There's a few things that this could be. My speculation is perhaps my regulator rectifier is starting to fail and it's maybe getting a little bit hot, or it's maybe malfunctioning. But before we get there, I want to do some additional tests just to make sure that all my grounds are good and that there's not something that I've wired up incorrectly here. Why don't we take a look at that and I'll show you kind of what I'm working on. I'll see if I can get this GPS to do what it was doing out on the road. And I am in my shed here. I've got all my windows open and I have an exhaust fan running to take any exhaust from the bike and blow it outdoors, so I'm nice and safe. And we're going to start it and see if we can simulate the issue here. What you want to look for is on this dash, it should come up and say power lost. Do you want me to continue? It might be very quick in the shed here because I'm going to let off on the throttle. I'm going to have to rev the bike up a little bit to see if I can get that voltage to drop low enough to trigger it. Then we'll put the multimeter on there and see what the multimeter does. But let's take a look at this first. Okay, we're in neutral. You can see that it registered charging power coming from the bike. That's what that little beep was. Let's see what we can do here. Maybe you might need a little choke. Might need a little fuel. All right, now that it's running, I'll give it some fuel and see if we can get the charging circuit to drop on this. Did you see that sign? Let's try it one more time here. I'll bring the camera in closer. All right, previously I was not able to make that simulate what I'm seeing on the road. But what you're seeing here is as the RPM rises, eventually the charging to the GPS shuts off. I'm going to hook my multimeter up onto this and we'll see exactly how much voltage drops. Interestingly, when I'm riding, that voltage drop happens much sooner in the rev range than what I'm seeing here in the shed itself. I have to rev it up pretty high to get that to cut out. When I'm out on the road, it's probably at most half throttle. I don't have a tach obviously on the DR at this point, so I don't know exactly when it happens in the rev range, but I do know from riding with the multimeter, as soon as I start to apply any throttle to the bike, the voltage starts to drop on the 12 volt system. Let me hook up a multimeter and we'll get another look at this to see if we can get a better idea of how much voltage drop we're seeing while the bike's sitting static. To test the voltage that's coming out of that 12 volt adapter plug, we're going to use a couple tools. One, I would say most people should have if you like to tinker on your bike or small equipment, and that is just a simple multimeter. This one, like I said, I bought off Amazon for probably $25 and it's got everything I need it to do. Your multimeter is going to come with either probes or something like this. I've got some little clips here, and you can test the output using just probes by probing inside the cigarette lighter plug or the 12 volt accessory plug. A better way is to get something like this, which is a 12 volt adapter that you would use to replace a broken end. And this one happens to come with banana clip connectors on the end of it. And the leads that I have for my multimeter, I can pull these clips off here to expose the banana connector, which in turn can plug right directly into my 12 volt socket here. I can plug that into my 12 volt outlet and we can test it in real time. Let's see what that looks like now. When I turn power on, right away, I can see that I'm getting 12.2 volts roughly from the battery. And if I turn the high beams on, I bet that'll drop. Not a whole lot. A little bit. I suppose the high and low beam on this Cyclops LED is 35 watts, both the high and the low side, so it doesn't really surprise me that I'm not seeing a huge voltage drop. You can kind of see the turn signals, they impact it. But let's start it and see what happens here. I'm just going to step around to the other side of the bike. All right. We're seeing 13.6 volts roughly coming out of the charging circuit, 13.7. That's good. That's charging the battery and providing more than enough power for the GPS. Let's see what happens when I rev the bike. Well, we can see at the power plug, we're going from 13.7 volts roughly at idle, as low as 11.5, and I think for a brief second there, I even saw 10 volts. And then it jumps right back up again once the idle drops down. Now, I'm not sure if that's normal or not for a motorcycle like this. I have to do a little bit of research to see if that's true. But there are a few things that I can do now to further test this. The next thing is I want to test the voltage at the battery itself at the same time as I'm testing the cigarette lighter and see if that voltage drop happens both at the battery and at the cigarette lighter, or whether or not it's just isolated to that 12-volt cigarette lighter plug. To do this, I'll have to get my secondary multimeter. I have 3 of them, I think. One of them I take on trips when I go snowmobiling. That's why I have 2 really good ones. And then I have a 3rd one around here somewhere that doesn't work very good at all. That's unreliable. Let me get that. We'll hook that up under the seat and we'll see and compare the 2 voltages. As most of you know, the battery is located underneath your seat and held in place with this retaining strap. To gain access to the positive and negative terminals, I'm going to remove this retaining strap so that I can probe a little easier with the multimeter. To do this, I'm just going to use a 10mm socket and take these out. Once I break them free, I'm going to switch to one of my favorite tools, the old nut driver. With the bolts out, this just lifts right off. Before I do anything else, I want to make sure that my connections are tight, which the ground is here, and that they're clean, no corrosion. Mine are in really good shape. None of the auxiliary connections are bad. And it really looks like it should be working really well. On the positive side of the battery, I'm going to ensure that it's tight, which this one is a little loose. I'm also going to make sure that the ring connector that I made to connect my dashboard is indeed connected. This is what feeds up to my dash right here. Everything seems nice and tight. So I'll start the bike and then I'll test the battery voltage across these 2 points as well, and we'll see if it matches our output at our cigarette lighter. I'll try to put both of the multimeters up on the handlebar so we can compare them side by side as I rev the motorcycle. So you're probably not going to see me for this test. Hopefully we'll see that the dashboard changes and the battery doesn't. But let's have a look at them anyway. I'll get this shot set up and then we'll return. Give me a second. I have this hooked up now. Let's just see what happens when I turn on the power. We're reading 11.3 volts through the 12-volt adapter. And if I touch my leads here, we have more power at the battery than we do at that. Now that might be because it's running through the relay. I'm sure the relay does impact voltage output, but let's see what happens if I start the bike and see what happens. Hopefully I can get it running relatively easy here. All right, let's see here. Okay, so we're seeing 13 volts. So we're seeing almost half a volt, 3/4 of a volt less at the plug. Now I got to see if I can rev this and hold it at the same time. This will be tricky. All right, here we go. That's very interesting. It doesn't look like the battery voltage drops below 13.5 volts, no matter what I do when I rev it. But you could see side by side, there was a lot of voltage fluctuation at the 12 volt outlet. I'm wondering if perhaps I have a grounding issue between the dash and the frame of the bike. I do have a grounding stud that I've mounted inside of that dashboard, but maybe that's not connected right, or it's got some corrosion on it. Something's impacting the voltages coming through that relay. If for some reason I can't get that system to work right, I do have a workaround. I could put a direct toggle switch to the battery and just turn the dash on when I want power up there. And that would probably, solve all of my issues. But I really do want to have it on keyed power. The other thing is I could leave it the way it is. It never sort of goes more than a couple seconds before the power comes back on. But it would drive me insane watching that warning sign flashing on and off. So I really do want to solve this. I think I've said this before. Electric stuff, electronics isn't my specialty, nor do I really like it. But sometimes you have to do what you don't like to get the results that you really want. All right, let's get on it. Because I noted right off the bat that my battery voltage, my static battery voltage with the bike not running, is a little bit lower than I'd like to see, I'm going to plug it into my battery tender and let it slowly trickle up as I clean the different contacts and grounds on the bike. It's really important to have a topped up, fully charged battery when you're doing tests like this. Your regulator rectifier and your charging system in general really is not designed to recharge a weak or dead battery. It's designed to maintain voltage in a fully charged battery and supply enough power to run your accessories, your lights and tail lights, and that's about it really. If you are starting out with a sort of a weak or a low voltage battery, your charging system is going to work extra hard, and it may be what's causing this GPS to keep dropping power. I'm not 100% sure, but I want to rule that out, so I'm going to fully charge it. Now, I have load tested this battery with my load tester, and it says it's a good battery. It just needs to be topped up. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to continue testing. From the battery, I have this flexible, I forget what it is, 12 gauge wire, 16 gauge wire, and it has an RCA connector right beside the tank right here. This way I can pull my dash off. I pulled this apart and cleaned that to make sure that that connector is nice and clean, and I've reassembled it here just to eliminate that possibility. I'm going to clean the contacts to the rectifier here. It's just on the driver's side or left side of the bike. And there's one connector on the bottom. So I'm just going to slide it out, and I'm going to hit these with electrical cleaner just to make sure that the connecting points on it are in good shape. I think I'm going to take this off here too. I'm not even sure what this one's for, but it's in the way. There we go. And I'll hit inside here with some electrical cleaner, and I might put a little bit of dielectric grease in that as well. This is just Ultra Seal. It's by Grote. You use this on electrical connections. It's very similar to dielectric grease. You don't need a ton of it. It just helps to seal out any moisture and corrosion. I'll put a little bit on there and then hook it all back up. Underneath my dash, you can see my fuse panel. I can have up to 4 circuits here. And next to that is the actual relay that powers it. So it provides power from the battery up to the dashboard. I want to talk just briefly about a relay, why I used a relay, and what all the little pins are on the bottom of these things, and what Carl and I tested when we actually tested the relay. What a relay is basically is an electronic switch. It uses a low amperage trigger circuit that activates an electromagnet, which in turn closes the heavy amperage switch, allowing your auxiliary lights or your heated grips, or in my case, my GPS, to activate. And you can use heavier gauge wire for that and have a lot more amperage. This one is rated up to 40 amps of draw across the primary connections. If you look down on the bottom here, you're going to find that all of these pins are numbered, and these are standard numbers on a 4 or 5 pin relay. Pin number 30 is where your high amperage load or power supply leads to. So this essentially for me is my red wire that would connect back to my positive on the battery itself. A direct line other than that RCA connection that I have. The 87 directly across from it here is the closed side of that high amperage circuit. So when the relay is closed, power is fed from pin 30 across to 87 and up to my fuse panel, and then distributed throughout the bike. Pins 86 and 85 are my low amperage trigger circuit. This is probably connected, the 86 I believe I connected to the keyed power source under the dash. There's a connection there for a relay, and then 85 would just go to the grounding peg on the dashboard that I built. So when I turn the key on, power is supplied to pin 86. It energizes the electromagnet as it travels to ground. That closes the circuit, allowing power from the battery to flow from pin 30 to pin 87. And that's how this relay works. Now that we know how a relay works, what are we going to do to test this thing? It's pretty simple, really. For the most part, if you apply power to that low amperage side, that trigger side, you're going to hear the relay click, especially if it's an old school one like this, not a solid state relay. The other thing that you can do is you can hook up a continuity meter to the high amperage side, and then when you apply power to the low amperage side, you're going to hear the circuit close as your continuity tester beeps like this. You can see that this relay works pretty good, so I'm going to put it back in the bike. If you're unsure whether your relay is good or not, maybe you don't have the testing equipment, they're pretty cheap. They're around, I don't know, $10 Canadian. In fact, I've bought this one here with the wiring harness and everything for $11 at Princess Auto. So you can just buy a new one and swap it in and see if that does solve your problems. What really does cause a relay to fail though? There's, I don't know, 2 or 3 different reasons, maybe 4 reasons why I can think of why a relay could fail. The first one could be carbon buildup inside of the relay itself, as it's constantly arcing and opening and closing that circuit. Carbon can build up in these things and give you some grief with them. That's why occasionally you'll get one that actually clicks but doesn't really work. The next thing I suppose might be excessive heat. So if you have it mounted in an area that gets very, very hot, there's the potential for that to maybe melt the varnish off of the windings on the electromagnet and maybe give you some problems that way. Next would be just general wear and tear on these things over the lifetime, cycle after cycle. The moving components in there could just wear out. And I suppose if it's in a very dirty environment, there may be the potential for contamination, maybe moisture to get in and corrode some of the areas. Whatever the reason, when these fail, they usually fail completely. Mine still has power coming through it. When I test it, it seems to be working really good. And I think for good measure, I'm going to take this brand new one that I bought at Princess Auto and just swap it in there just to be sure as we continue down our testing rabbit hole. What I noticed is after I charged the battery, I could test the voltage at the cigarette plug and get 13.5 to 13.8 volts out of that connection. It still dropped when I revved the engine, but I think my main problem is maybe my battery wasn't fully charged when I took this out for a ride for the initial testing of the GPS. That being said, it still seems to drop off the charge when the bike is revved up quite a bit. And that might just be because I still don't quite have the battery fully charged. I think what I might do for now though is I'm gonna run the GPS off the USB port that's on the GPS unit itself instead of the 12-volt charging cradle. The reason I'm going to do this is I'm getting a solid 5.4 volts out of my USB plug. And the reason for this is, even though there's a number of connections to get to that USB socket that I installed, it gets well over 12, more like 13.5 volts to it, which it converts down at the plug to 5.4 volts. So it's very, very consistent. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of voltage as it steps it down to 5.4 volts. I believe that's why anyway. So I'm getting really good voltage through the USB. So I think I'm going to run it like that for a while. And then I'm going to try the charging cradle again after I take the bike for a really good ride and see if that improves it. But for now, I'm going to hook it up. We'll go to the next step. That works really good. I am really pleased with the performance of that GPS now. There's still a few things I need to figure out. I don't really have the street maps loaded in like I said in my earlier videos, and the mount's a little bit wobblier than I want, so I might see if there's an aftermarket mount that holds it a little bit more securely now that I'm using the USB anyway. It doesn't need to have that charging cradle. So maybe Ram makes one that's really solid and will hold it in position. I'll have a look, and if you know of one, please put it down in the comments below. And speaking of comments, again, I'm not a real expert with electrical. If you have any opinions on what's going on, if it's normal for the way the charging drops like that, or if there's any other things that you think I should explore, please put those down in the comments below so that I can learn and others can learn from your experience as well. Okay, I had a great visit over there with Carl, and I'm pretty tired for the day. My wife and I have been bird watching over at Long Point all day today, and I just did my ride tonight, did the bike yesterday, and I'm ready for a little bit of a rest and put my feet up. So until I see you next time, you have yourself a great day, and remember, tinker easy. I'll see you soon.